It was a Friday night in May of 1946. The house smelled like coffee and cigarette smoke, the sort of quiet that settles over a farm after dark. Virgil Starks sat in an armchair with a newspaper, the radio playing low. His wife, Katie, was in the bedroom. Then came the sound of breaking glass, 2 shots through the back window, and a room turned into a place of terror. She would later stagger across 2 lawns, barefoot, blood in her face, find a neighbor who could help, and gasp, "Virgil's dead."
It's the image that lingers. An ordinary evening shattered. Hi, Claire. Thanks for having me back on Still Unanswered. This case, it doesn't feel like history the way some do. It feels like an attic where every time you open the door, something else falls out.
Hey, Marcus. Yeah. And listeners, welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Claire Donnelly. Tonight, the Texarkana Moonlight murders, the phantom killer who stalked lovers' lanes and a farmhouse in 1946, a town gripped by panic, and a man named Ewell Swinney, who many argued was the killer, but who was never charged with murder. Over the next hour or so, we're going to walk the dark roads of that spring, sit with the survivors, peel back the police work and the rumors, and ask, why does this story remain unresolved?
We'll talk about the victims as people, not headlines. We'll look at why policing in the 1940s made a case like this so slippery. And we'll be honest about the limits of evidence, what's factual and what's conjecture. There's a lot to cover.
Right. Let's start by putting Texarkana on the map. Tell listeners where this is, Marcus, because the geography matters.
Texarkana is literally 2 towns with 1 heartbeat. The city straddles the Texas-Arkansas state line. In 1946, it was a railroad and lumber hub, semi-rural, a network of piney woods, small farms, and a downtown that felt like the center of everything for the region. People left doors unlocked. Teenagers parked to make out. It was Southern, conservative, segregated. Jim Crow was part of daily life, so the social texture shaped how the community responded to violence. And importantly, it was on major transportation corridors. Trucks, transients, servicemen, Texarkana saw a lot of strangers pass through.
Yeah, and the post-war moment, there's this tension, back to normal, but with men coming home from war, and the after effects of violence and trauma hanging in the air. People were relieved the fighting was over, but there were other instabilities. Guns were widely available, so I think the town had a brittle sense of security, like if anything broke, it would crack wide open.
Exactly, and those cracks opened in early 1946.
Let's go chronologically. First, February 22nd, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Lafferty. The only time we had 2 living victims who saw the attacker close up. Marcus, walk us through that night.
Hollis and Larey parked after a movie. Lover's Lane scene, very common. Around 11:45 p.m., a man appears with a flashlight wearing a white cloth mask, think pillowcase with eye holes. He ordered Hollis out and, in one of the more baffling and chilling parts of the file, told him to remove his trousers. "Take off your goddamn britches," is what Hollis quotes. Hollowed-out menace. Then he'd bludgeoned Hollis twice with the butt or barrel of a gun. Hollis's skull was fractured. He survived. Larry fled. There are conflicting reports about the sexual assault. Some contemporary reporting is vague because papers held back details in deference to modesty. But clearly the attacker was violent and not shy about domination.
And the mask shows up. It's such a small, grotesque image. Someone in a pillowcase at the window of a parked car. That detail will follow the town like a ghost. But at that point, police treated it almost as an isolated robbery gone wrong.
They did. It wasn't until the killings in March and April that investigators began to link the events in the public imagination into a pattern.
March 23rd, 24th. Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. A double murder discovered by a passing motorist. They'd been shot in the head. Money left behind. This wasn't robbery. And then, April 13th, 14th. Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin. 2 teenagers. Paul drove from Kilgore just to give Betty Jo a ride from a gig. Both dead. The town shifted then, didn't it?
Shattered. Betty Jo was a standout saxophonist, honor student, church kid. Paul was 17. There's a tenderness in the record. He had driven to be kind. These deaths struck the town's sense of safety more than the earlier attacks. When you kill kids like that, popular kids, church-going, people stop thinking this is a random, isolated danger. The press begins to call the killer a serial attacker. The papers coined the name that would stick, the Phantom.
And the murder weapon, ballistics linked the .32 caliber automatic to at least some scenes. Then, May 3, Virgil and Katie Starks, the farmhouse shooting. That one's different in so many ways. Married couple, a rifle through a window, .22 caliber. What did investigators make of that?
There's real division. Publicly and in newspaper pages, people quickly linked it to the Phantom. The fear wanted everything to be one monster. But some investigators, Sheriff W.E. Davis among them, expressed skepticism. The weapon is different, the target different, and the locale is a farmhouse miles from the other scenes. It could be the Phantom expanding his crimes, or a separate criminal altogether. The investigators on the ground hedged, and the absence of modern forensics made that ambiguity fatal for closure.
Let's pause on the human side. We need to name victims beyond shorthand. Betty Jo Booker was 15, talented, a high school junior. Paul Martin was 17. Griffin, 29, a war vet, and Polly Ann Moore, 17. Jimmy Hollis, 25, survived, as did Mary Jean Larey. Virgil and Katie Starks were a working couple on a quiet Friday night. I want listeners to feel them as people.
Yes. One technique I use when I teach students about these cases, try to place an ordinary detail in your mind. A saxophone left in a case hidden in the woods. A radio loud in a living room. A car with the front wheel tucked off the road. These sensory details make the victims real. Betty Jo's saxophone being found, the instruments and mundane objects that anchor them remind us they were more than victims of a myth.
And that's why the case still digs at people. The town's sense of normalcy was pierced, so investigators scramble. Tell me about who shows up to help. Rangers, state police, and that famous name, Manuel T. Gonzalez.
Gonzalez, lone wolf, was a celebrity ranger. Bringing him in was partly tactical, partly public relations. Texarkana had local sheriffs on both sides, city police, and Arkansas State Police. The FBI did consult, but didn't take over. Coordination was messy because you're dealing with 2 states, multiple jurisdictions, Texas and Arkansas law, separate sheriff offices. That fragmentation slows everything.
And forensics? Forensically, 1946 is limited ballistics, shoe and tire prints, witness statements. No DNA, no modern chain of custody. People also remember the way evidence was handled, less rigor. That matters when you're trying to build a case 8 decades later.
Massively. Scenes weren't cordoned off the way they would be now. Homes were entered, items moved. Bullets and shells were cataloged to the best of their ability. Ballistics even then could offer some linkage. But many pieces that might have mattered were not preserved or are now lost.
Rumors and vigilante activity complicated work, too. The town bought out guns. Teenagers cruised with pistols pointed at other cars. One officer was nearly shot because a woman in a parked car had her pistol trained on, turns out, an officer. It was chaos.
And rumors are corrosive. They push cops to chase false leads. There were stories the Phantom had been caught and was being secretly jailed. There were theories about doctors, preachers, returning veterans. All those threads stretch attention and resources thin.
Okay, let's move into suspects. Hundreds were investigated, some false confessions. But tonight, we need to talk about the name that recurs, Ewell Lee Swinney. Marcus, you've studied mid-century criminology. What do investigators and later researchers say about him?
Well, Ewell Lee Swinney, Marcus, you've studied mid-century criminology. What do investigators and later researchers say about him?
Ewell Swinney was from Oklahoma and Arkansas roots, a son of a Baptist minister, born 1917, poor, with a long petty crime record, car theft, counterfeiting, property crimes. In July 1946, stolen car patterns led Trooper Max Tackett to a stolen vehicle that pointed to Swinney. When police picked up his wife, Peggy, her statements began to change everything. She offered details about the Booker Martin murders and implicated Ewell, claiming she'd heard admissions and describing elements not widely publicized.
Peggy's statements are the linchpin, but then spousal privilege, Texas law then, meant she couldn't be compelled to testify against her husband. So that evidence evaporated in court. They pivoted to convicting him for car theft, life sentence as a habitual offender, but not for murder.
Right, and that's the ethical gray area you mentioned earlier. Investigators like Tackett and Tillman Johnson remained convinced Swinney was the Phantom. Some authors, most notably James Presley, have argued strongly for Swinney's guilt, citing Peggy's initial statements, the pattern of stolen cars, and the fact that the murder stopped once Swinney was imprisoned. But circumstantial stopping is far from proof. The problem is lack of physical evidence. No murder weapon tied to him, no fingerprints or DNA then, and Peggy's reliability is arguable. She recanted in parts, possibly under pressure, possibly out of fear, possibly out of loyalty. We can't know.
There's also an ugly side to the era's profiling. Dr. Anthony LaPaula, the prison psychologist, weighed in with analysis that had racialized assumptions, basically ruling out black suspects as not clever, which tells you how the frame of the investigation was distorted by bias. That matters because local racial tensions under Jim Crow could have diverted investigators' attention or made certain communities less likely to be believed if they said something.
Absolutely. LaPaula's comments are a reminder of how criminology back then carried the same prejudices as the broader society. Those assumptions can leave blind spots in an investigation.
Listeners, let me ask you a question now. Don't answer out loud, but think. If you were an investigator in 1946 Texarkana, what would you do? You've got a frightened town, a mask motif, limited forensics, several suspects who confess and then recant, half a dozen leads leading nowhere. Marcus, what would your priorities be?
Containment first. Protect potential targets, secure lovers' lanes, get patrols out. Second, consolidate intelligence. Get all agencies talking, create a log of tips, and corroborate. Third, preserve evidence as best you can. Fourth, build timelines for prime suspects. And fifth, this is crucial, avoid the PR trap. The pressure to produce a public suspect can wreck a case. Don't let your investigation be driven solely by the need to calm a panicked public.
Good point. Unfortunately, that PR pressure did shape things. The newspapers wanted a label. The Texarkana Gazette's editor suggested the Phantom because it sold. It gave shape to the panic. Names like that stamp an unsolved case in a certain light. We think of a single monstrous personality rather than a messy series of crimes with different motives.
And the label informs copycats and imitators. Media can shape behavior. The phantom became a cultural template.
Let's get back to Swinney. Some points for the prosecution: Peggy's detailed accounts, investigators' convictions, and circumstantial cessation of attacks. Points favoring doubt: no physical evidence, Peggy's recantation, contradictions in timeline. Marcus, where does the weight fall for you?
I call it probable but not proven. In forensic terms, we'd say there's a preponderance of circumstantial evidence pointing toward Swinney, enough for investigators to pursue the theory aggressively. But legal proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not with what survived. If Peggy's initial statements were truly independent and contained non-public details, that would be powerful. But by the time you could put a case together, that testimony had been withdrawn, and the material traces were thin. So, historically, he's the strongest candidate, but the case technically remains unsolved.
Some of our listeners may hear that and feel unsatisfied, like guilty that there's no neat ending. But maybe that's the point of this episode, to be comfortable with ambiguity while still honoring the victims. We have to resist the urge to slap a guilty label on someone without a trial.
Yes, and there are other suspects who cropped up. Henry Tennyson, Ralph Baumann with his fugue, an escaped German POW, a swaggering hitchhiker who bragged about the murders. Many were ruled out. McSpadden, found mutilated, some thought he was a victim, others thought he was the killer. All of these reflect how people tried to make sense of the horror.
I want to read a short passage from an interview with a local. This is from a Gazette retrospective. A woman who remembered the summer of 1946. We didn't park on main roads. We pulled into driveways. We stayed at home. Mothers didn't let the kids cross the street after dark. People bought guns. It was like living under a bell that could ring at any moment. I can hear it when I read it, those small changes to daily life.
It's a useful reminder that crime transforms ordinary behavior. The social landscape is as much a casualty as any body. The Starks, for instance, after the shooting, the household dynamics, sleep habits, even faith practices, everything shifts. People went to church in search of comfort. Others built up suspicion like an armor.
Let's talk about evidence handling and why reopening the case now is so difficult. Marcus, you've looked at how evidence degrades. If someone wanted to re-examine the files in 2026, what's realistically possible?
First, many physical items are likely gone. Bullets, shell casings, if preserved, could be re-examined, but chain of custody is often broken. DNA testing could theoretically be applied to clothing or bullets if they exist, but contamination is almost certain. Many records, interviews, notes are dispersed. Witnesses and lawmen are dead. So you're left with reports, newspaper accounts, archived files, maybe a few artifacts. Reanalysis can be helpful in clarifying timelines and correcting errors, but it rarely produces definitive new evidence in cases this old. It can, however, strengthen or weaken the probability of particular theories. Swinney, Drifter, multiple killers.
So the best path might be archival, oral histories, and perhaps tracking down any surviving material evidence. But even that is a long shot.
Yes, and there's also the ethical dimension. If someone today wants to name Swinney absolutely as the Phantom, that has consequences for descendants and for the historical record. We need caution.
Let's take a short detour. Culturally, the case took on a life of its own in film and folklore. The Town That Dreaded Sundown, both the 1976 film and the 2014, they mythologize and fictionalize. How did the movie change the story?
The 1976 film, directed by Charles B. Pierce, leaned into the mask, the Lover's Lane terror, and the helplessness of small-town cops. It blurred fact and fiction, changing names, compressing events, and dramatizing for effect. That film made the Phantom more archetypal, part urban legend, part slasher prototype. The 2014 film then layered meta-elements on top, treating the 1976 movie as real within its own universe. These cultural creations keep attention on the Texarkana murders, but also obscure nuance. Movies trade complexity for archetypal fear. That helps sell tickets and keeps the Phantom's image alive, but it can hurt living families who remember real people, not characters.
And the town itself had ambivalent feeling about it. Outdoor screenings of the movie became an annual ritual in Texarkana. Some folks accept it as dark tourism. Others think it exploits trauma. There's no neat, correct answer there either.
Right. Community memory is contested territory. Some see owning a narrative as catharsis. Others see it as a commodification of grief.
Okay, I want to move into a segment where we do something a little different. Let's debate the two big unresolved questions and tussle over them, briefly and not nastily, but with honest pushback. Question 1. Was the Starks farmhouse killing part of the Phantom spree? Question 2. Was Ewell Swinney the killer? Marcus, you take the Starks question first. I'll press you.
All right. For the Starks, I lean toward possibly not. The rifle caliber .22 differs from the .32 used in the double murders, and the target is different. Older married couple at home, not young lovers in a parked car. Those differences could indicate a different motive and offender. But, counterpoint, killers can and do vary methods and targets. We can't assume a serial offender is method consistent. They evolve. Also, the public and press had a strong desire for a single narrative, one Phantom, so they may have improperly folded the Starks into the series.
I hear you, but I want to push back. While weapons differ, the Phantom may have been improvising based on opportunity. The brazen nature, shooting through glass, trying to enter the home, there's the same desire to terrorize. And the Starks attack happened in the same time frame as the other attacks. So, for me, provisional yes, it's part of the spree. The differences are concerning, but not disqualifying.
Fair. I'll grant that. I'll say probable, but not certain. Similar temporal cluster, similar night predation, similar want to control and terrorize. The evidence just isn't definitive.
Good. Now, Ewell Swinney. Marcus, you already said probable but not proven. I disagree. Maybe. I worry we let investigators' personal convictions ossify into consensus too quickly. Peggy's statements could have been influenced by police suggestion. She may have been trying to protect herself or protect someone else. If she gave details that were truly not public, that's persuasive. But we don't have clear proof she did. So I lean toward skepticism. I don't think you can responsibly put Swinney on trial in the court of history without more.
And that's the responsible stance. Look, Tackett and Johnson were sincere. They saw things we only see in documents. Their judgment is heavy. But historical judgment must balance contemporary belief with empirical evidence. Swinney is the best candidate we have. For historians and criminologists, that's often enough to say most likely. For legal certainty, it isn't.
Listeners, this is the sort of tension that keeps this case in our heads. We want narratives, closure, a villain, a verdict. But history and ethics sometimes say, live with uncertainty.
Claire, there's another angle. We should talk about how the Phantom contributed to national tropes about Lover's Lane killers and influenced later cases in media. The Zodiac, for example, built on the idea of a masked attacker targeting couples. Texarkana is an early American case that fed the cultural imagination.
Yes, Texarkana is a prototype, and the mask motif, pillowcase over a face, is so primal in its attack on intimacy. It's taken on mythic proportions. Marcus, before we move to close, let's talk about what justice looks like now. For families and a town, what does resolution mean when prosecution is impossible?
Closure comes in different forms. For some, it's a legal verdict. For others, it's acknowledgement. Honest storytelling that names victims, preserves memory without sensationalism, and resists simplistic labeling. For scholars, it's rigorous re-examination, archive work, transparent presentation of evidence, and uncertainty. For the community, it can be memorials or rituals, though those are complicated, as we've said. Ultimately, part of justice is refusing to let a crime be reduced to a myth while erasing the people at its center.
That's why we chose to focus on the lives rather than the legend tonight. Before we go, Marcus, any detail people often miss that you want to leave them with?
Yes, people often imagine the Phantom as a single cinematic monster, and that's partly the press's doing. But there were many small institutional failures: fragmented jurisdiction, poor evidence preservation, racial bias in investigative assumptions, and the social pressure to produce a suspect. If we want to learn from Texarkana, we should focus on the systems that failed to protect people and failed to secure evidence for the future. That's the hard, unromantic lesson.
Beautifully said. Okay, final thoughts for listeners. If you're drawn to cold cases, remember that curiosity is good, but so is humility. These are human tragedies, not just puzzles. We owe the victims like Betty Jo, Paul, Richard, Polly Ann, Virgil, Katie, Jimmy, and Mary Jean more than a headline. We owe them the patience to let evidence, not rumor, speak.
And if any listener has archival tips, old letters, family stories, photographs, please consider contacting the Texarkana Gazette or Historical Society. Sometimes the smallest detail, a ticket stub or a diary entry, nudges a narrative forward.
We'll link to resources and reading in the episode notes. Presley's book, Newton's work, contemporary archives. Marcus, thank you. This was precise, humane, haunted, and heavy.
Thank you, Claire. Heavy, yes. Necessary.
That's it for tonight's episode of Still Unanswered. If this episode raised more questions for you, good. We like questions here. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into cases where history left a blank. Please, be thoughtful in the comments. These are real families. For Betty Jo and Paul, for Virgil and Katie, for all of them, thank you for listening. Sound of a train horn in the distance, then fade to a low, single piano note.
Bye.